From the Preservation Maryland studios in the historic podcast district of Baltimore, this is PreserveCast. In a world where rational, scientific explanations are more available than ever, belief in the unprovable and irrational in fringe is on the rise. From Atlantis to aliens, from flat Earth to the Loch Ness Monster, the list goes on. Enter Colin Dickey, cultural historian and tour guide of the weird. With the same curiosity and insight that made Ghostland a hit with readers and critics, Colin looks at what all fringe beliefs have in common, explaining that today's Illuminati is yesterday's flat Earth. The attempt to find meaning in a world stripped of wonder. On this week's PreserveCast, things are about to get weird as we enter the unidentified, mythical monsters, alien encounters, and our obsession with the unexplained. Hey, this is Nick here, and I want to thank you for listening. Your downloads help us out a great deal and are attracting a lot of interest to this podcast. As you probably know, or I hope you do, PreserveCast is powered by Preservation Maryland, a nonprofit organization, and we depend on listener support to keep us preserving. So consider making a quick donation today at preservecast.org and give us a 5-star review. It actually helps. Also, our friends at Cheap Old Houses are helping support our work by donating all the proceeds from their sale of Save All the Old Houses pin until September 18th. So head over to presmd.org/pin and get one so you can show your old house pride. Thanks. Now, let's get weird. Colin Dickey is a writer, speaker, and academic, and has made a career out of collecting unusual objects and hidden histories all over the country. He's a regular contributor to the LA Review of Books and Lapham's Quarterly, and is the co-editor of the Morbid Anatomy anthology. He's also a member of the Order of the Good Death, a collective of artists, writers, and death industry professionals interested in improving the Western world's relationship with mortality. With a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Southern California, he's an associate professor of creative writing at National University. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast, and today we're very excited to be joined by Colin Dickey, who is the author. We've actually spoken with him before about his other hit book, Ghostland, but now we're going to be talking with him about The Unidentified, Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and our obsession with the unexplained. So, Colin, it's a pleasure to have you back. Excited to talk with you about this new book. Just for listeners who maybe didn't hear our first episode, or just to ask you again, where did you grow up? And I suppose what got you interested in this aspect of history and human nature?
Well, thanks for having me back on. It's great. It's great to be back. Let's see. I grew up in San Jose, California, and I guess coincidentally or not, that town has now played a prominent part in both my last two books. San Jose, California, which is a pretty banal suburb in a lot of ways. There's not too much interesting going on, but it does have two pretty eccentric claims to fame, one of which is the Winchester Mystery House, which was a focal point of my last book, Ghostland, which is supposedly one of the most haunted houses in the United States. It's this sprawling 161-room Victorian mansion built by Sarah Winchester, who was the daughter-in-law of the guy who sort of pioneered the Winchester rifle. And there's lots of really bizarre stories swirling around the construction of that house, and that's what kind of became kind of the anchor for my last book. The other cool thing that San Jose has to offer is the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum, which is this sort of bizarre Egyptian temple that rises up out of the suburbs that was built by this guy, Harvey Spencer Lewis, who assembled a really stand-up Egyptology collection. It remains one of the best collections of Egyptian artifacts west of the Mississippi, and but he advocated a number of sort of eccentric beliefs, including the idea that California was itself a remnant of the lost continent of Lemuria, and that underneath Mount Shasta is the fabled city of Telos, where the Lemurians exist. And so, so this book, being among other things about lost continents like Atlantis and Lemuria, I once again found myself back in San Jose, sort of spelunking the weirdness there.
Yeah, this book definitely touches on the weirdness, and you get a taste for the weirdness, but it's not just a book about weird things. It's also about why we believe the things we do, I suppose, and how much that has changed even in recent years. So for people who have read Ghostland, what should they be prepared for in the Unidentified? How would you sort of summarize the book for people who might be interested in picking it up?
I mean, for me, this is like my sort of weirdly. I mean, okay, so we can start with the sort of obvious difference. Ghostland was about haunted places and sort of why certain structures come to be known as haunted and what those stories say about ourselves. That's the Unidentified moves into cryptids like Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, the Jersey Devil, as I mentioned, the lost continents of Atlantis and Lemuria, and also UFOs and aliens. But I think for me, as I was putting this book together, one thing that made sense to me in my head was that I felt very much that Ghostland was a book about, or not about, but a book that was heavily involved in the question of architecture of spaces. Like, why do we, how do we live in the places that we build? How do we inhabit these buildings of various kinds? And as I was working on this book, it occurred to me this is a book about the wilderness and frontiers and margins and sort of the edges of civilization. So the connecting thread that kind of stood out to me after a while was this idea that Bigfoot is a creature that lives in the redwood forest of Northern California, so sort of near San Francisco, but not sort of just outside, just where things get wild. Whereas Area 51, where, supposedly, the government has aliens, is, likewise, it's sort of in the Nevada desert on the edge of Las Vegas, just sort of just outside of civilization into kind of this kind of, wilderness zone. And I kind of found myself going back to that through these various, investigations and pieces, sort of thinking about how we kind of, we kind of populate these areas just outside of civilization with these kind of strange creatures, for better or for worse.
Yeah, it's sort of funny because in a way, I guess we're scared of the places we live in. We're also scared of the places we don't live in. So there doesn't seem to be a safe space for humans. I don't know if that's like a suburban strip mall or something. We haven't imbued them with much sense of at least terror yet.
It's weird, especially because it's funny you say suburban strip mall, because as I was kind of moving through the genealogy of some of these spaces, what I ultimately ended up talking about were FEMA camps. This idea that the government has prepared these disused industrial spaces that at any moment they're going to be used to round up good American citizens, and again and again, you find conspiracy theorists who argue that various disused Walmarts and other sort of empty big box stores are, sites for future FEMA camps. So it's not even the suburban strip mall anymore. It's sort of
nothing is safe.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that it's a sort of fundamental component of human nature to kind of project this kind of sense and unease and uncanny onto the surface level around us. And I think that is something, I mean, like I grew up, like a big fan of like noir, and that's the premise of noir, right? The premise of noir is that, just below the everyday normal surface, there's something terrible and terrifying that you will never really understand and you will never be able to defeat or cope with. And if you, go poking around in there, all you'll find is your doom, And so I think that's a kind of, a steady feature of human consciousness, this belief that, lurking beneath the surface is something terrible that is waiting for us whenever we're ready.
And that sort of seems like 2020. Like we have delved into the noir. The noir has been opened, right? Like
right. Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, this whole sense of like, things were normal and now they're not normal, was kind of how a lot of people felt, I think, for like 2017 or so. But, the longer we've been here, the more it's been clear, like, oh, things were never normal. We just kind of had a little bit of like a kind of superficial patina that pretended everything was normal. And once things started to go wrong, things went wrong in a big way because things were always wrong. That's my optimistic thought for this morning.
So one of the things that you write in the book, I think it's early in the book, you talk about how there was a survey done that showed between 2015 and 2018, in both cases, belief both in Bigfoot rather, and alien visitations, both of them almost doubled. They went from like 11 to 21% and 20 to 40%. And that's like a really short period of time, right? Like to see human emotion and human understanding, human beliefs change that much in like 3 years, what on earth is going on with the way we think?
Yeah, it was interesting to me when I started this book. Originally, it was much more about like conspiracy theories, like writ broadly. So I cast a wider net in my original, the original book proposal and the original drafting. I was looking at a bunch of different conspiracy theories, and overwhelmingly, a lot of those were really paranoid and pessimistic in ways that were sort of hard for me to get a handle on. And when I narrowed the focus down to as I said, sort of cryptozoology, Bigfoot and friends, and UFOs and lost continents. Like what I found a kind of a mix of two kind of competing human emotions, which I think speak to your question. Like what has happened. Like on the one hand, I think a lot of this is about a kind of paranoia and anxiety and fear that has been ramped up in the past couple of years, and there's a lot of factors going into that. Everything from the political situation to social media to other global changes. But the second thought is a kind of desire for wonder or magic, which I think has simultaneously sort of ramped up. And I think there's a various set of factors that have influenced that. But I think like what you see in the rise of these beliefs is you see these kind of parallel tracks, one of which is about a desire for a kind of re-enchanted or a world that's once again a little bit magical, a little bit unexplained, a little bit mysterious, and then simultaneously an increasing sense of anxiety and fear. And those two impulses, I think, drive a lot of these beliefs.
Is there a sort of a historical precedent for all of this? Like, did our ancestors go through periods of times like this? I mean, since this is sort of a history preservation podcast here, I like to bring it back to the history, and I know that you have a real sense for that too. Like, is this without precedent, or do you see this happening kind of cyclically?
Well, yeah, again, it was interesting for me coming off a book about ghosts because, ghosts are a belief that, human culture has always had, since written, recorded history, we've had ghost stories, for whether or not you believe them or not, they're part of a kind of fundamental human psyche. And when I went looking for these stories, I found them much more historically grounded. And my take, my sense was that there are a couple of factors that really started in the 19th century that drive the current articulation of how we think of things like cryptids. Like, for example, like we've always had a world filled with monsters, right? There's always been, strange things. And again, that goes back to, Gilgamesh and the Bible and whatever. But in the late 18th and into the 19th century, you had the rise of Linnaean classification, which is this idea that like science could actually taxonomize and name every single creature out there, and so the awful kraken becomes the giant squid, and things that used to be sort of fearsome monsters now have names, and and so there is a kind of what gets called a kind of disenchantment of the world, right? This idea that like no longer are there going to be strange monsters or unknowable things. Anything that is out there can be known. And that really kind of tracks into the second half of the 19th century. And it is in the wake of that you start to see things like the rise of like cryptozoology and the rise of beliefs in things that, sometimes, get named after Charles Fort, AKA, Fortean things that are stubbornly unknowable, that it sort of exists outside the realm of science's ability to name those things. So it's a much more recent and historically grounded phenomenon that I found myself tracing in this book. And I think it really comes out of a rise of a shift in how we understand the world. We understood the world in the 19th century.
So it's interesting you brought up Charles Fort, because I was going to bring him up next. I mean, from Lemurians, which you've already brought up, to the meat showers that you describe. Yes, meat showers. You also have this central theme, in addition sort of this disenchantment and sort of this the scientific piece of this, that there's also right now, this deep thread of sort of, and you've touched on it with FEMA camps and stuff, this distrust of science, of government. I mean, we see that every day now, not just with this, but it's something that, you know, hucksters take advantage of, like a Charles Fort, or conspiracy lovers are like just ready to take it all in. And I'm curious, is this unique to the United States, or do we see this everywhere, or is it right now something that's hyper focused here in the US?
Oh, I don't think it's unique to the United States, and I think it's an ongoing issue. And I think one of the things that gets lost in our current moment, you know, when I feel like, you know, we're sort of pushing back so hard against, you know, climate denialists and, you know, intelligent design people and stuff like that, and we're really trying to sort of advocate that science is objective and good, which in many cases it is, but it's also not infallible. And I think, you know, I mean, particularly, so what I found in the book is, you know, like you think about the late 19th century, science was as good as the scientists doing it, you know. And so, you know, I mean, of course, we know that there was lots of, you know, racial and gender inequities like baked into scientific understanding and all these things. And so science and the scientific establishment sort of becomes institutionalized in the 19th century. This idea that you have now professional organizations, you have universities, and now if you want to make a scientific discovery, you can't just be a kind of splendid amateur in your room with a microscope, you know, or experiment in your backyard. Now you need funding, you need a PhD, you need a research lab. So there's this move towards a kind of professionalization of science, which triggers, again, a kind of backlash where you get people who really want to kind of celebrate amateurism. And you know, most prominently, I think you see that with cryptozoologists and kind of the guys who, and they're usually guys, not always, who are like, you know, I'm not gonna get a PhD in primatology. I'm gonna go out on the weekend with my buddies and I'm gonna bag a Bigfoot, you know, which is a very different kind of way of thinking about science. So there, you know, I do want to push back a little bit against the idea that science is this like good and pure and truthful monolithic force, because I think that's disingenuous. Although at the same time, I also want to say, you know, vaccinate your kids, climate science is real, you know, evolution is real. So it's like, you know, right. We're at this real moment where it's like, there's so many bad faith attacks that it's really hard to have good and productive, constructive criticisms about science. And
right.
But I guess to circle back to your question about the United States, I mean, I think that you can point to a series of shocks, you know, particularly in the United States in the 70s and 80s, but, you know, again, with global implications. And I think, you know, you could talk about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. You can talk about the Challenger disaster. You can talk about the botched response to the AIDS pandemic. And you can talk about the tobacco lawsuits. You can see the ways in which science via government and big business and big pharma really failed American citizens in a dramatic, spectacular way. It sort of revealed itself to be both sort of arrogant and also uncaring. And so those shocks, I think, had additional reverberations, you know, that triggered things like the anti-vax movement and other things that sort of, you know, rose out of that, where people, you know, we haven't had that kind of truth and reconciliation moment that we probably need to sort of come together once again and re-articulate, you know, what is good science, what is bad science, how are we going to build consensus as a community, how are we going to ensure that these scientific edifices take care of our citizens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a long-winded answer to that question.
No, I think it's very interesting. And, you know, in terms of truth and reconciliation, we haven't even had, on the political side, we haven't had that since Vietnam, right? Like, Americans' belief and trust in the government really plummeted after that. And so I think you're right. I think it's just we've never had that moment where the American family comes to the kitchen table and is like, all right, we need to get our S on the table here and figure this stuff out. You know, we haven't had that.
Yeah, and it's gotten to the point where it's sort of increasingly schizophrenic, where, you know, in our contemporary current moment, you have you have people on the right who say they distrust government, but yet have complete 100% faith in the president of the United States, which is sort of an open contradiction in terms, you know. And on the left, you also have people sort of, sort of celebrating governmental norms at the same time that they have, sort of legitimate fears that, they are being targeted or being, arrested without due process, et cetera, et cetera. And so, again, what I tried to do in the book is, like with cryptids or the lost continent of Atlantis, like you either believe Nessie, the Loch Ness monster, exists or you don't, but you don't think that the government is hiding evidence of the Loch Ness monster. Whereas if you believe in UFOs, almost by default, you believe that the government knows more than they're letting on. And so for me, what was interesting was to take two different kind of spheres of belief, cryptids and UFOs, and trace them historically and see how, one of them became bound up in a kind of question about, science and biology and naturalism, and what do we know and who knows it and that kind of thing. And the other one became quickly about the government. The other one became quickly about conspiracy and paranoia. And so, while this wasn't quite explicitly a book about, conspiracy theories writ large, what I tried to do is I tried, by tracing the history of UFO belief in the United States, particularly from World War II on, is to say that this is how a desire for wonder and a desire for magic and a desire for, something out there in the world, how that over time can evolve to become something, really poisoned and paranoid, where you're convinced that, the abandoned Walmart is going to be a future home for, the rounding up of citizens in concentration camps.
Yeah, it's an interesting journey, and definitely something people should pick up. We're talking with Colin Dickey, who is the author behind the Unidentified, Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and Our Obsession with the Unexplained. And this would be a great place to take a quick break. We'll come back, have a few more questions before we end our interview here with Colin. We'll be right back on PreserveCast. 100 years ago in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States was signed into law and officially granted 20 million American women the right to vote. This mass expansion in voting rights was the result of generations of intense activism known as the women's suffrage movement that has had a lasting legacy on the continued fight for equality in America. In recognition of the struggles and achievements of a once disenfranchised majority, PreserveCast is honored to share remarkable stories of suffragists within each episode this year. Beyond the Ballot is supported by Preservation Maryland, Gallagher, Avelius & Jones, Attorneys at Law, and the Maryland Historical Trust. To learn more about influential women, past and present, or to donate, please visit ballotandbeyond.org. This week on Balloting Beyond, we'll learn about an influential force for good in Baltimore, Sally Michael. Read by Jana Carey, Director of Operations at Preservation Maryland.
Sally Michael. Sally Michael was an understated force who helped to make a city. In the 1970s, she won a $20 auction bid to have lunch with then-Mayor William Donald Schaefer. It turned into a lifelong collaboration of creative problem-solving and coalition building. Her daughter, Carter Brigham, wrote, "Mayors, congressmen, and young Baltimore City children all came under her purview. Her dinners and salons generated ideas that grew into much of the landscape and institutions of modern-day Baltimore." During her lifetime, she was on the board of 57 local and state organizations, chairing 19 of them. They included the Walters Art Museum, the University of Maryland School of Social Work, and the Baltimore Planning Commission that developed the National Aquarium, Center Stage Theater, and Harbor Place. She was a founder and supporter of the Baltimore School for the Arts, which opened in 1979 and introduced thousands of influential Baltimoreans to the school. In 1983, Mayor Schaefer asked Michael to develop a private-public partnership to enhance the city's parks. The result was the Parks and People Foundation, which became a national model for urban parks, recreation, and community environmental work. She also worked to establish the Baltimore Chesapeake Bay Outward Bound School. More than 77,000 people have gone through the program held at Lincoln Park. In 1996, she organized Super Kids Camp, an enriched reading program for elementary school children to provide experiences that also included horseback riding, sailing, music, acting, and painting. She gave every summer camper a copy of The Little Engine That Could. Every day of her adult life, she repeated her high school motto: help us to remember that what we keep, we lose, and only what we give remains our own. Sally Michael died in August 2018.
This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Today we are joined in studio by Colin Dickey, the author of The Unidentified, Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and Our Obsession with the Unexplained, which is currently available wherever you get your books. I read it on my Kindle, and it was a quick, fantastic read, and definitely encourage people to pick it up. We've had some really philosophical conversations here, so we'll go a little bit more rapid fire as we move to the conclusion. I did mention meat showers, and I thought maybe you could just, I hate to bury that term and not give that any explanation. You want to maybe touch on that a little bit in Charles Fort?
Yeah, right. No, and I feel like it's my job to, if I do anything with this book, it is to bring the Great Kentucky Meat Shower to the fore of public consciousness. So, right. So in Olympia Springs, Kentucky, which is in Bath County, right on the edge of West Virginia, in I'm blanking on I think it's 1873. Am I right? I'm now. All right, anyways, it's in the book. Read the book. You'll get the details.
Go read the book.
It's a sunny March day. There's not a cloud in the sky. This woman is out with her grandson, and chunks of meat begin falling from the sky over like about 100 square foot area. These meat chunks, some of which are a couple inches in diameter, just fall out of the sky. And again, you whatever you think happened, this happened. This wasn't a hoax. This wasn't a hallucination. The townspeople arrived. They gathered up the meat. They put the meat in jars. There were a couple guys who, extremely brave souls, tried to taste it to see if they could identify it by taste. That did not go well. And then for a while, this became a sort of question. This became bandied about in scientific journals where, people were like, what the heck is this meat? And there were sort of different theories proposed and sort of evaluated and then abandoned. And there's a commonly accepted explanation for the meat shower, but personally, I think it's not a great one. I don't think it actually works very well. And so I don't feel that I came to the end of the book feeling like I wanted to say exactly what the meat shower was.
Right.
But anyway, so the meat shower then becomes, I first read about the meat shower in the works of Charles Fort, and Charles Fort's 1919 book, the Book of the Damned, where he collects all manner of these phenomenon. He's probably most famous for chronicling various reigns of like frogs and fish. People who've seen the movie Magnolia, they will recognize the Fortean touches in that. And Charles Fort's idea, the idea of the Book of the Damned is his idea is like there are facts, there are stories, anecdotes, reports that are damned by science. They're excluded by science. They're treated as these sort of untouchable, unspeakable things, but yet they happened. And so the Book of the Damned is this collection of things that sort of exist outside of the realm of what science can know. And I think, and what's great about Ford is that in his best moments, he doesn't try to give a solution. He just sort of lays this stuff on the table. He does it every so often, try and argue a hypothesis, but every time he does, it sucks. And it's so much better when he's just kind of laying this stuff out. And that's the term Fortean, which is, this idea of these kind of unknowable, unexplainable things, which informed a lot of the book.
Right. And that's a fantastic explanation of the meat showers. And I forgot about the connection with the frogs and the fish. So watch out. If you see things falling from the sky, Colin may chronicle you in a future book. We never know. Couple rapid fire questions here. Do you, Colin Dickey, believe in UFOs?
I think that's one of those questions that's really broad. Do I believe that there's...
Well, right, because the way I asked it is, do you believe in unidentified flying objects? And in that case, that's a pretty easy thing to believe in, right? Because there can be things that are unidentified.
Yeah, do I believe that there are things that fly that I don't know what they are? Yes, sure. Do I believe that there is somewhere in the universe, extraterrestrial life seems almost certain. Do I believe that extraterrestrial life has developed some kind of sentience or civilization? Sure. Do I believe that extraterrestrial life has developed the capability to travel at the speed of light through the universe? Less so. Do I believe that that alien life has been able to master interplanetary travel, got as far as Earth, and then crashed? No. Like, that's a hard, like if they can figure out how to fly here, they ought to be able to stick the landing, is my feeling, right? So like the sort of story that like, they got all this way and then, like just right at the end, just kind of, botched the landing and crashed like that. So, right. So it's like, I believe in a lot of these things, but the more tangible things get, the harder it is, I think, to hang on to these beliefs, because they require such an elaborate set of suspensions of disbelief to sort of make the narrative fit, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think one kind of along those lines, I think it was Bill Maher who once said, like, for people who believe in conspiracies about big government and the deep state, they're like, have you ever seen how the government operates? Like, how could they possibly keep these secrets? Which is kind of a funny way of looking at it, but it does require sort of the suspension of disbelief. And I think you also point out, it might be early in the book, this idea that people see patterns where they don't otherwise exist. And we have a knack for kind of putting weird things together and making a pattern.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, a thing when people ask me about, do you think this conspiracy theory is true or whatever, a thing that I default to is, I mean, we know there are government conspiracies and we've unearthed them, Watergate and Iran-Contra, and like, when usually is the case that when people start looking for a conspiracy theory, they find evidence of it quite quickly, and Woodward and Bernstein, as I like to point out, I mean, they got a lot of their information from secretaries. They got a lot of their information from like, administrative assistants who were not part of the grand cabal, but like were the ones who did the document shredding and wrote the checks and that kind of stuff. And so the Area 51 conspiracy theories, they presuppose a bureaucratic infrastructure that involves a lot of entry-level minimum wage jobs. Somebody's got to cook that food. Somebody's got to take out that trash. And it's harder and harder to sustain the idea that people making $20 an hour have an investment in keeping these grand secrets from the world, especially once people start asking questions, because that's usually how these things, get unraveled. So, do I believe there are government conspiracies? Yeah, we know there are. The question is, are they this far-reaching, this totalizing, and this hermetically sealed? And as you say, like, it's the government is not that good.
One last rapid fire here. Bigfoot, is he out there? Are we going to find him? This is another one that is hard for me because when Bigfoot first burst onto the kind of American consciousness in the 50s and 60s, you have these stories of these guys are like, I don't know, I was camping and I saw this thing in a clearing and I grabbed my camera or my my Super 8 camera and I managed to get one blurry photograph or just a few seconds of a video. And you can watch that and you say, oh my gosh, that, who knows, maybe that's real. And now everybody's got iPhones. Everybody's got high def cameras in their pockets all the time. And so, again, statistically speaking, if people were finding these things, we should probably have really good video of them by now. And, and I spent some time with some Bigfoot hunters who showed me some pictures, sort of grainy pictures of forest, and we're like, see, that's an arm, that's a face, and again, like you can see patterns where if you look at a grainy forest long enough, you will see a face, I guarantee it. But does that mean that there are there's Bigfoot out there? Nah. But what I will say is like there are still a lot of animals out there that we haven't discovered, and that's again one of the great things about science. And in fact, there was a primate species discovered in Africa
within the last decade, like a brand new primate species. So it's not the case that there aren't new and strange and wonderful creatures out there to be discovered. What cryptozoologists tend to do is they tend to sort of think of these things as lying outside of scientific taxonomy. And I think that's a really interesting contradiction.
Interesting. Well, this has been really fun and so interesting to get a chance to talk with you about this fantastic book, The Unidentified, Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and Our Obsession with the Unexplained, which you can pick up now. If people want to learn more about you or your previous books or what's coming up next, where can they find you?
I mean, my website, colindickey.com. You can also find me on social media. I'm on Twitter and Instagram most vocally. And in both cases, it's just my name. But yeah, find me on Twitter and say hi, or, shoot me an email or something like that. I love to talk about this stuff all the live long day. So yeah.
Yeah. If there's a meat shower in your community, let Colin know.
Yeah, definitely. Call me first. Yeah.
And before we go, final question here. What is your favorite historic site or place?
My favorite historic site or place is, where to even start? Is it bad if I say the Winchester Mystery House? Since it was the first, it was the formative consciousness in my mind. That I'm going to go with that. It's
a creepy place and something you can learn more about if you pick up Ghostland. Colin, this has been a pleasure. We appreciate so much having you with us, and looking forward to seeing what you write next.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back. This has been super fun.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's show, notes, and all previous episodes, visit preservecast.org. You can also find us online at Facebook and Twitter at PreserveCast. This program was supported by the Historic Preservation Education Foundation. PreserveCast is produced by Preservation Maryland in Baltimore City. Thanks again for your support, and remember to keep preserving.